Hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to today's Coffee with a Survivor. We're excited to welcome George Elbaum to speak with us today. George, the floor is yours.
Sierra, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'd like to tell you about the world that I was born into, a dangerous world that I survived, but only because of major luck, in a world that I hope none of you ever have to experience. The place, Warsaw, Poland. The time, September 1939. Hitler's Nazi armies invade Poland, and that starts World War II. With hundreds of airplanes, thousands of tanks, and 1 million troops, the Nazi army sweeps across Poland and conquers it in 1 month. Then they hold a victory parade on the streets of Warsaw. And even Hitler himself comes to view it. I think you recognize Hitler with his arm outstretched. Now, I was born in Warsaw. I lived there at that time, but I don't remember this because I was only 1 year old. But I remember most things since I was 3. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, I had a family of 12 people, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Within 3 years, out of that 12 people, only my mother and I were still alive. The other 10 were all dead, murdered by the Nazis. Why? Because they were Jewish. As you probably know, the goal of the Nazi Party was to exterminate everyone who they considered undesirable. Jews were on top of the list, but there were others: gypsies, invalids, gays, handicapped people, socialists. But Jews were on top of the list and the largest group. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, there was 3.5 million Jews living in the country. By the end of the war, 5 years later, 90% of them, 9 out of every 10, were dead, murdered by the Nazis. What became known as the Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews during the 5 years of the war. Now, 6 million is a huge number. It's not a human number. I can't feel it. And in my talks, I like to present something that people can also feel. So let me suggest the following. You, I presume, all live in the Chicago area. Population right now is about 2.7 million, I believe. So that means that 6 million Jews killed in 5 years. That's equivalent of about 2.5 cities the size of Chicago. Every man, woman, and child in Chicago killed every 5 or 6 months, and they're repeated again after the next 5 or 6 months. Every man, woman, and child in Seattle. Try to feel that, understand the magnitude of the Holocaust. 2 cities the size of Seattle. I'm sorry, Seattle, Chicago. Now, the question is, why did the Nazis do it? And the answer is anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews. But anti-Semitism is just like all the other antis, whether it's anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, anti-white, anti-gay. It's hatred for someone, not because they've ever done anything to you, but because they're different. Maybe a different color skin, maybe a different way of worshiping God. And all the antis are nothing but negative, and they always end in destruction. I give probably most of my talks, I give to high schools or middle schools. That's by choice. And I tell them that I hope that when they grow to maturity, they realize that to do anything good in this world, we have to be for things, not against things. I tell them, please try to remember that. And from the correspondence I get from students afterwards, that seems to be something that they do remember. So, in addition to the cruelty and inhumanity of murder on what I call an industrial scale, you can also ask yourself, how is it possible to do that? How is it possible to kill every man, woman, and child in Chicago every 5 months and then repeated again for the next 5 months? Well, the Nazis did it they started by establishing what became known as the ghettos. In each of the cities, in the countries that they conquered, each of those, they chose 1 or 2 or 3 major cities that already had a large Jewish population. And in those cities, they focused on the Jewish neighborhood, and they chose a small part of it. Like in Warsaw, they chose about 2% of the area of Warsaw, even though the Jewish population of Warsaw was not 2%, but it was 30%. So By the way, I'll just be talking about, okay, and there they established the ghetto within this small 2% area. They built a wall around it, a brick wall with barbed wire, with gates with soldiers that were guarded by dogs and machine guns. And once the wall was erected, the Nazis swept the other 98% of Warsaw outside that wall, which is probably where about 80% of the Jews lived, outside that wall. They swept all of that 98% and they forced everybody into this small walled-in ghetto, this 2% area of Warsaw. And then the Nazis swept the rest of the countryside, the smaller towns and villages and smaller cities in the whole Warsaw region. And some of them had Jewish populations of up to 50%. I know that because I've spoken in some of these cities over the last 5-6 years in their high schools. And the Jewish populations in those smaller cities is now zero. So the Nazis collected the Jews from the whole Warsaw region and all of Warsaw outside of the 2% ghetto, and they forced them all into this walled-in ghetto. So obviously, within the ghetto, which is where my family lived, all the housing was occupied. We were all living there. So what happens to the people that are being forced in from the outside? Well, if those people are lucky because they have friends or relatives living in the ghetto, they would move in with them. And I remember when I was about 3 years old, suddenly there was like about a dozen strangers moved into our apartment, which at that time only my mother, my grandmother, and I were living there. The men in the family, like my uncle, my grandfather, they've already been taken away by the Nazis. They were all dead by then, but we didn't know about it until after the war. So these strangers that moved in, they were sleeping on the couches, on the floor, in the kitchen, in the hallway. I asked my mother, I said, Mom, who are these people? What are they doing here? My mother said, well, they're friends. They'll be with us for a little while. And they were with us for a little while because once the Nazis were satisfied that they've collected people from the whole Warsaw region, when I say people, they've collected Jews from the whole Warsaw region and forced them all into this small walled-in ghetto. They would start to take people out of the ghetto, putting them on trains, shipping them to concentration camps, and most of them to the gas chambers. So rather than telling you about it, I'm going to read to you a chapter from a book that I wrote 11 years ago. The book is called Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows. It's the same slide that you saw at the very beginning. And the reason I put this on the cover of my book is that's a scene that I remember. I was 4 years old and I remember that, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. So, and by the way, I'll just be talking about the Warsaw Ghetto. That's where I lived. That's what I remember. It was by far the largest of all the ghettos. So I'll read to you a chapter from my book. It's a short chapter called Umschlagplatz, which in German means selection point or shipping point. Now, I do not speak German. I never did. The first time I heard the word Umschlagplatz was when I was 4 years old. I'm 83 now, so that was 79 years ago. I've never forgotten that word, Umschlagplatz. Suddenly there's loud shouting coming from the courtyard. Then the entire apartment complex was filled with ear-splitting noise. Shouts, screams, doors banging everywhere, and heavy running footsteps. My grandmother ran into the room holding my coat, grabbed my hand and led me to the staircase, which was already filled with people, all going downstairs. When we reached the courtyard, it was already full of people crowded together in groups, with soldiers in dark green uniforms, shouting orders and walking between the groups. My grandmother held my hand tightly as we were pushed back and forth by the crowd, till finally we were standing at the edge of our group, facing the large arched entry gate that led from the street into our courtyard. It seemed that we stood there a long, long time. And I remember being glad that my grandmother put my coat on because I was getting cold. And I remember seeing some groups being led by soldiers out of the courtyard through the big gate. Next slide, please. Now here you see the big gate in the back. And you see people are being led out and they're guarded by soldiers with machine guns. Then suddenly I saw my mother running in through the gate, holding a piece of paper in her hand, showing that paper to some soldiers, talking with them, and then coming to us, to my grandmother and me, and leading us out of the courtyard. It was only years later, after the war, that I understand what happened. The Nazis were emptying out the Warsaw Ghetto, apartment block at a time, and shipping the residents to concentration camps. My mother was working at that time at a factory in the ghetto, which the Nazis authorized the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to manage and make uniforms for the Nazi army. My mother somehow learned that our apartment block was being emptied out that day. And she got from her factory director an official document allowing her to keep her family in place. With this document, in effect, a temporary permit to continue living. Think about that for a moment. That little slip of paper was a temporary permit for my grandmother and me to continue living. With this paper, my mom managed to convince the Nazi officer commanding that day's sweep to let us go. Had she arrived a few minutes later, it might have been too late. Because if my mom had arrived a few minutes later, my fate would be probably like that of the little boy that you see on the screen, because he lived maybe another week or two longer after this photo was taken. Because from here, these people were taken directly to freight yards. Next slide, please. And loaded onto freight cars or cattle cars and taken directly to concentration camps. And all children, most women, or all the older or weaker men will be almost immediately sent to the gas chambers. So if my mom had come a few minutes later, I probably wouldn't be here with you guys today. I would have been killed decades and decades ago. Pure luck, pure luck. What happened next? I mentioned that if people were lucky because they knew people living in the ghetto, people who were being forced into the ghetto had friends or relatives living in the ghetto that moved in with them. Well, what if they weren't lucky? What happened to them? They would have to live on the street. And Warsaw is a northern city. Chicago, New York, Toronto. It gets very cold at night, windy, cold, ice, snow. And because of that, I mean, the street in Warsaw is not a good place to be living on there. And because of that, 80,000 people died during the 2.5 years of the ghetto's existence. They died from starvation. They died from disease. They died from exposure to the elements in the winter. And I remember many winter mornings, I'd wake up to a sound, something like clunk, 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 clunk. It was a sound of a wooden wagon being pulled by men over the cobblestone streets of the ghetto. They were collecting bodies of people who had died during the night and taking the bodies out. The ghetto was not a good place to live. It was not a good place to die. Next slide, please. Here you see a couple of kids freezing, begging for food. There was no food to be given. We were all starving. What happened next? My mom was a very smart woman, and she realized that the days of the ghetto and everybody in it were numbered. So she decided to try to get us to safety while there was still a chance. In the first place in our flight to safety is a place I call the shed. Next slide, please. And the reason that's on the cover of my book is that I remember that scene, that exact scene. And I'll read to you a chapter called The Shed. We can only speak in whispers here, my grandmother told me. We were now in a large shed with corrugated metal walls and ceiling, pieces of rusting metal equipment strewn about, and our bags and blankets on the floor. Several families were here with us, no one that I recognized, all with bags and suitcases and blankets. One family even had a little black dachshund, and the owners told us that it never barks. I petted his soft fur and I played with him. Some of the people played cards, some knitted, but no one spoke except in very quiet whispers. My grandmother took some bread and sausage from her bag, made tea on a little chemical burner, and that was our dinner. When it got dark, no one lit any candles. We wrapped ourselves in our blankets and we slept. I woke up in the morning and I wanted to play with little black dachshund, but it was gone. So I asked its owners, where is it? And their only answer to me was, it's gone. Years later, my mother told me that during the night, its owners had to choke it to death to keep it from barking at footsteps outside the shed. If any of you have a small pet, dog or cat, can you imagine choking it to death on your own lap? I can't. The day, or perhaps many days, went by slowly in the near silence, the only sounds coming from outside the shed. There was a big hole through the shed's roof, through which I watched white clouds on the blue sky. Once I saw an airplane with black crosses on its wings flying across the sky. Exactly the scene that you see there. That is what I remember. At that time, I didn't know that it was a Nazi airplane and the black crosses were Nazi insignia. It just looked so beautiful to me against the blue sky. It wasn't constrained in a dark shed as I was. And it felt strangely drawn. I felt strangely drawn to it. I wanted to be in it. I wanted to be somehow with it. I never lost that feeling and interest in airplanes. A few years later, after the war, I would avidly read Polish aviation magazines. Then later on, after we moved to America and lived in Oregon, I went to high school, and there I was designing and building and flying model airplanes. In college, I majored in aeronautical engineering. I worked in the aerospace industry, took flying lessons, got a private pilot's license, crashed an airplane and walked away from it without a scratch. And then for 20 some years, I flew hang gliders in Southern California, crashed maybe half a dozen times, walked away from all but the very last one. And on that one, I crashed near the top of a mountain in Southern California. I woke up 6 hours later in a hospital. And for my next birthday, my wife gave me a present. It was a video taken from a newsreel helicopter showing a rescue helicopter lifting me unconscious from the top of the hill on a rope and taking me to the hospital. However, I've never forgotten the airplane against the blue sky through the hole in the roof and the feeling of awe and exhilaration that it gave me. And that is why I put it on the cover of my book. What happened next? My mom put my grandmother into what she thought was a safe hiding place within the ghetto. Paid a lot of money to put my grandmother in there. Turns out it wasn't safe, but we only learned that after the war, the betrayal. So thinking that my grandmother was safe, my mom smuggled herself and me out of the ghetto. What happened in the ghetto afterwards? Within a few months, I don't know, 4 or 5, I was at that time, 4 or 5 years old by then, 4 years old. Enough information and news managed to, including some eyewitnesses, managed to smuggle themselves back into the ghetto and warned everyone that those who were being shipped out were mostly dying in the gas chambers. So a group of young civilians, several hundred of them, they decided that they would rather die fighting than die in the gas chambers. And this stage what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now imagine a group of young civilians, several hundred of them, 300, 400, 500, no military training. They had some rifles and some pistols hidden in the ghetto. They rose up against a trained Nazi army of thousands of soldiers with tanks and artillery and airplanes. The ghetto fighters knew they had no chance. They knew it was a hopeless, hopeless act of defiance. And they fought for about 2 or 3 weeks, and every one of them was killed. Next slide, please. Here's a photo taken in the ghetto. Every man, woman, and child that remained in the ghetto was killed, every one of them. And apparently, Hitler was so furious, personally insulted that the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto dared to rise up against his army. He ordered the army to tear down every building within the walls of the ghetto. Next slide, please. Here, this is a panoramic shot of the ghetto. You see everything in front of you. That is the ghetto, and everything is in ruins. The black line in the back are the buildings of Warsaw outside of the walls of the ghetto. Now, what happened? How did my mom and I survive outside the ghetto? The next slide, please. This is a photo of my mom when she was 7 years old together with her brother. It is the only photo that my mom managed to hide under her blouse for all the years of the war of herself and anyone in her family. My mom was a very smart woman. She was a young attorney before the war. At the university, she learned English and she learned French. So the first thing she did after getting us out of the ghetto, she dyed her black hair blonde so she would not look quite so Jewish. Then she bought the identification papers of a young Polish Catholic woman who had died, and she took on that woman's name. And the next time my mom saw me, she told me, And that woman's name, by the way, was Śliwowska. That's a nice Polish Catholic name. So the next time my mom saw me, she said to me, your name is no longer Elbaum. Forget Elbaum. Your name from now on is Śliwowski. And if anybody asks you, do not forget it. And my mom probably bought another set, maybe 2 or 3 sets of fake ID papers during the war to keep the Nazis off her trail. And every time that she bought a new set of fake ID papers, my mom would tell me what my name was. And I had to remember that. Now, so my mom survived by luck, strength, and wits. For the first jobs, and her first job was by being an English governess or French governess to wealthy Poles who wanted the kids to learn those languages. When those jobs ended, because people during the war ran out of money, my mom took on whatever was available, and she became a cook, a nurse, a scrub woman, a laundress, whatever, as long as the job came with 2 benefits. Benefit number 1, room and board at the apartment of the people who hired her. The reason that was critical was that she wouldn't have to walk to work back and forth every day, because every time she was on the street, she could be picked up by Nazi patrol or police and sent to concentration camp, fake papers or not. Requirement number 2, a little bit of cash to pay to the people who were keeping me, because my mom realized that I would be safer if I was raised by Polish Catholic families together with their kids. My mom tells me that when I was throughout the war, when I was 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 years old, my hair was light brown and I didn't look Jewish. It's only after the war that my hair turned dark brown and then black. And then about 10, 15 years ago, it turned light again. When I speak to high school kids, I tell them, ask your grandparents if you don't know how that happens. So my mom survived by luck, strength, and wits. I survived by luck only. I'll give you an example of my luck. Probably the last family with whom I lived. I remember I was sitting at a table eating soup, and it must have been evening, because I remember that somebody was lighting a kerosene lamp on the table. So I'm sitting there eating soup, and all of a sudden there's loud banging on the front door and loud shouts in German, and everybody rushed to the front door. But I didn't. I just continued to sit there and eat soup. Why? Probably because I was hungry. I was hungry through most of the war years, but essentially everybody at some time or another, probably in Poland, was hungry because there was not enough food in Poland. But I was being kept by strangers, and sometimes they didn't treat me very well, and sometimes they didn't feed me, or most of the time they didn't feed me very well. So I was hungry through most of the war years. So I'm sitting there eating soup, ignoring the commotion that's behind me. So all of a sudden I sensed somebody was staring at me. And I remember I turned to the side like this. And all of a sudden, and I realized there was that a tall Nazi soldier was staring straight down at me. I remember he had on this heavy dark green coat, so it must have been wintertime. And on his shoulder, he had a machine gun. Now, I've never seen one before. And apparently machinery fascinated me. So I just kept staring at it and staring at it. I've never seen one like that. So I just kept staring. And probably that's why I eventually became an engineer, because I was interested in machinery. So I kept staring at his gun. And then eventually I looked at him in the face and I smiled at him. And then I continued to eat soup and I ignored him. He stood there another moment or two, probably trying to decide what to do about me. And then he moved on, and soon he and the other soldiers were gone and all was quiet. I realized, I learned after the war, that had I shown any fear whatsoever, he would have made me drop my pants to see whether I was circumcised, because only Jews were circumcised in Poland at that time. And if that had happened, I would have never reached my 5th birthday. So again, pure luck. Now, I lived with about 4 or 5 different Polish Catholic families through the war. My mom would move me from one to the next, one family to the next, whenever the family with whom I was living alerted her to danger to me and danger to them. And the reason was that in Poland, the Nazis decreed that any Poles caught hiding Jews would be immediately sent to concentration camps along with the Jews that were hiding. So the families with whom my mom placed me, they weren't doing it for the pittance that my mom paid them. She paid them all the cash she was making, but that was pittance. They were doing it because they thought it was the right thing to do. And I'm going to ask you a challenge question, and I'd like you to answer it and answer it honestly, but answer it only to yourself, not to anybody else. Imagine that, that the company for which you're working, it's a good company, a very good job. You have some nice promotions, and they have a foreign operation, and they offer to turn that operation over to you. You'd be the director, general manager of their foreign operation if you move to that country and manage it. And you think it's a great offer, so you do that. But when you get there to that country, you learn that the government of that country is prejudiced against a small minority. They're arresting them, throwing them in jails, beating them, killing them. And you know that you could save one of them. Imagine you could save a little undernourished 4-year-old kid, as I was at that time, if you took him or her into your house or apartment. But if you did that, you might be risking maybe your life. Would you do it? Would you do it? Please think about it, but answer that only to yourself. But the 4 or 5 different Polish families that took me in, they took that risk and they saved me. If it wasn't for them, I would not be here with you guys today. They saved me. The last family with whom I lived was headed by a man named Leon. And his is the only name I remember. Just his first name. I don't remember his last name. I don't remember any of the names of the other people with whom I lived. The reason probably is that I liked him. He was always fair to me. He was kind most of the time, but he was also tough. And when I did something to disobey him, he beat me, and it hurt. But I always knew why he was beating me. And if it involved eating some food that I wasn't supposed to touch when I was alone in the apartment and I was hungry, sometimes it was even worth the beating. So I liked Leon. I didn't like his wife or their little daughter, maybe a year younger than I. So let's say I was 4, she was 3. Because whenever my mom would visit me, that might be once a month, once every several months. The last time I didn't see her was 6 months. My mom would bring me a present. It might be a little wooden toy like this, or it might be a hard-boiled egg, which was a nice present in wartime Poland when most everybody was hungry. My mom always made sure that I ate that egg in her presence. She wanted to make sure that I got it. But after my mom would leave, Leon's wife very often would take away the little toy and give it to their daughter to play. So I didn't like them. Now, I was with Leon from the beginning of 1944 through the end of that year into January. And that included August 44, time of the Warsaw Uprising. Now, Warsaw Uprising differed in one very fundamental way from the Ghetto Uprising. The Ghetto fighters knew that they would all die. They knew they had no chance. It was truly a hopeless act of defiance. The Warsaw fighters had a chance because this was now August of 1944. They thought they had a chance because, first of all, there's like 20,000 of them, and they had some weapons, mortars, machine guns that were airdropped to them by the Royal Air Force from England because they were supported by and loyal to the Polish government in exile in London. So they thought they had a chance, primarily because the Russian army was by that time sitting right across the river, and the Moscow radio was encouraging the fighters to start the uprising and promising them that they would cross the river and help the fighters liberate Warsaw sooner, liberate Poland sooner, and the war sooner. That was the big pitch. That was a huge lie. The Russians had no intention of crossing the river and helping the Warsaw fighters because they knew the Warsaw fighter was loyal to the pro-Western government in London, and the Russians had other intentions. They intended to turn every country they liberate from the Nazis into a communist satellite. So they wanted all the Polish underground to be killed, and they just sat across the river and watched, and they waited while the Nazis killed off most of those 20,000 fighters and turned Warsaw into a total ruin. Next slide, please. This is what Warsaw looked like in October, November, after the uprising was finally put down. It was a total ruin. Now, how did Leon and his family and I get out of there? Leon must have got wind that the uprising was going to take place, because a day or two beforehand, he bought a pedal powder rickshaw, and his wife and daughter, having loaded a bunch of suitcases and cardboard boxes, they put it onto the rickshaw. And the morning of the uprising, starting on the 1st of August, 1944, his daughter and wife and I sitting on the luggage, and Leon pedaling in the back, pedaling the rickshaw in the back, we left the city. The Warsaw Uprising had just started. About an hour later of heavy pedaling, we were finally in the countryside. And Leon finally pulled off the side of the road to rest. And I asked him where we were going, and he said, to my cousin's farm. I wandered away along a ditch that ran beside the road, and suddenly I noticed, lying right next to the ditch, something like a large potato, large blue potato. I picked it up, and it felt cold and heavy like metal, and had a shiny ring on one end of it. I put my finger through that ring, and I pulled, and it came out in my hand just as Leon called that we were leaving. So I tossed the object over my shoulder, and I was standing next to the ditch, and I ran to the rickshaw. As I jumped onto the rickshaw, there was a big explosion where I had just been, and Leon started pedaling furiously, much faster than before. It was only later that I learned that the dark blue object was a Nazi hand grenade, and if Leon had called me a few seconds later, I wouldn't be here with you guys. It would have exploded in my hand. So once again, pure luck. And Leon didn't know what I had done, but he did know that with the uprising now in Warsaw, any Poles found by the Nazis near weapons or explosives would have been shot on the spot. So if there had been any Nazi troops in the vicinity of where we stopped, they heard the explosion, they would have tried hard to find us. And if they did, they would have killed all of us. So once again, pure luck. Now, I was with Leon on that farm through the end of the year into January. And suddenly, the first week of January, right after New Year's, my mother appeared. I never knew when I'd see her, even if I allowed myself to think about it, whether I would ever see her again. And it's been 6 months since I saw her. So obviously that was the happiest moment of my childhood, seeing my mother alive after 6 months of time separation. About a week later, my mom woke me up. It was nighttime, I was sleeping, and she woke me up. She had tears in her eyes, and she said to me, "You are saved." I didn't know what she was talking about. But she took my hand, pulled me out of bed, and dragged me behind her. And I knew we were going to the main room of the farmhouse. But when we came there were soldiers there. But they didn't have the dark green uniforms of the Nazis. They had olive uniforms. And when when we walked in, I was the only little kid in the room. And and my mom bent down to me and she said, "They're Russian." Now, that didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know anything about Russia. But when we walked in and the soldiers saw us, I was the only kid in the room. This little kid, I was 6 years old. 5 actually. Anyway, one of the soldiers reached into his pocket and took out a little white cube. And he got it handed to me just like this, towards me. I didn't know what it was. So my mom said, "That's sugar, take it, taste it." So I put it in my mouth, and I swear it was the best taste I've ever had my whole life. And ever since that moment, I've got a tremendous sweet tooth. I can start dinner with dessert, have dessert for the main course, and end it with dessert. And I would do it occasionally, except my wife never lets me. I mean, I know she's right, but I still love to do it. I call that moment the sugar cube miracle. And about a week or two after the sugar cube miracle, we learned that the Soviet army had pushed the Nazis out of Warsaw. So my mom and I returned to Warsaw, mostly by walking, occasionally getting or a ride on a military truck. And we came to Warsaw. The center of it looked like just what you see there, except there was a lot of snow. It was a snowy winter. And occasionally here and there, I could see half buried in the snow, a body or two left over from the battle between the Nazis and the Russian army. My mom very quickly got a job because she had been an attorney before the war. She very quickly got a job with a brand new book publishing organization that which the Polish communist government started to print books and propaganda. And her job was to go around the country and reopen bookstores because most bookstores in Poland were closed during the war. So she would certainly need transport to go to some of those further away cities. Public transport wasn't available, so she was given a car and a driver. She didn't drive. It was sort of a car. It was a little old pre-war three-wheeler, each wheel about half the size of a normal car wheel, like one in the wheel in the front, two in the back. The driver was given a machine gun and she was given a pistol. The reason was that in the Warsaw region, the Nazis had killed off all of the pro-Western underground, so there was no resistance to the Russian takeover, communist takeover in the Warsaw region. Some of the regions where my mom and her driver needed to go, there still were pockets of pro-Western underground resisting the communist takeover. And they knew that only the government owned cars, so they would attack cars on the road. Luckily, my mom and her driver never needed to use their weapons. So pure luck again for them. The next slide, please. This is a photo of my mom and me in a Jeep. That means the little three-wheeler must have already died. That was a very happy time for me because I thought that my mom would never again park me with strangers the way she had done during the war. But that's not, well, first of all, I'll read to you a chapter called Summer 1945, Returning Prisoners, Falling Stars. I'll read you part of a chapter. Several times during those early months after the war, my mother and I went to the railroad station on news of trains arriving from Russia, carrying Polish prisoners from the Eastern Front. My father, an attorney and a reserve officer before the war, was called to active duty during the war's first few days, and he had been sent to the Eastern Front. And my mother hoped that he had been taken prisoner and would be returning from Russia on one of these trains. My mother was understandably filled with hope and anticipation as we waited for these trains to arrive at the station. But for me, it was a strange and an unsettling mix of expectation and concern. On the one hand, I wanted a father in my life, and I was quietly envious of children who had one, like Leon's daughter. On the other hand, I had no memories of my own father, as I was only 1 year old when he left for the front and never returned. So the train for which we were waiting might bring a total stranger into our life, and I could only hope that I would like him and that he would like me. Together with a lot of other people, we would stand at the station's entrance and watch and wait while the gaunt and bedraggled men filed out slowly and wearily. They were gaunt and bedraggled because they were prisoners in Russia for years. Sometimes there were joyous shouts as the waiting and hopeful spotted one of their own, followed by much embracing and tears of happiness. Mostly, however, the arriving men shuffled by ungreeted, perhaps because they were not from Warsaw and had to travel further to find their families, or perhaps because there were no survivors in their families to greet them. My mother was always quiet when we left the station after finding no one. We would walk home in total silence. There was a very happy time for me because I thought that my mom would never place me with some strangers, but that's not what happened. Because 2 years after the war ended, so like early 1947, my mom put me on a train with a group of other Jewish orphans or half orphans. We were going to go by train to Paris, and then Paris we would go to a port, and from France we would sail on a ship to Palestine. Not Israel, because Israel wasn't founded yet for another year and a half. Next slide, please. This is my passport photo. So I was 8 years old for that trip to France and then on to Palestine. Uh, why was my mom sending me away? I never asked. Please, I don't remember. I think I would have remembered, but I never asked. But apparently I learned when I was writing the book, which was 11 years ago, that um, right after the war in Poland, the next 2 years, 1945 and 46, war in Poland about January or February of 45. During those next 2 years, there were pogroms in many parts of Poland where mobs of anti-Semitic Poles would drag out any Jews that survived in their small towns, beat them, kill them. During those 2 years, several hundred Jews were beaten to death or shot by Polish mobs. So my mom was sending me away for my safety, I presume. I would probably be living in Israel had it not been for an accident. One evening when we were already in France, several of us were roughhousing, chasing each other. I tripped, fell, and I had this tremendous pain in my leg. And I was lying there crying, and one of the adults, came over and knelt down beside me and lifted my leg up, and I screamed with pain. And I remember him telling somebody, I think his leg is broken. We better take him to the hospital tomorrow. But it doesn't sound serious to you or to me now. But at that time, it was very serious to me, because right after the war, I saw so many people without arms or legs that I was sure if you break an arm or leg, they cut it off. I was sure of that. And when one of the other kids with whom I was playing knelt down beside me and said, hey, don't worry, you'll be playing soccer with us tomorrow. I thought, how am I ever going to play soccer again? I'm going to spend the rest of my life on one leg. I obviously didn't sleep very well that night. The next morning, they took me to the hospital. And when they were putting a cast on my leg, hip to toe, I asked the man who took me there, I said, why do they bother doing this? They're just going to cut my leg off. He laughed at me, says, don't worry, they want to cut your leg off. In a couple of months, they'll take off the cast, you'll be as good as new. I was one very happy little 8-year-old at that moment. They sent me back to my mom in Warsaw. The rest of the camp went off to Palestine. But 2 years later, in 1949, I was back in Paris with my mom. Next slide, please. This is now summer of 1949. So we've been there for several months. This may be my birthday photo because I turned 11 that August. How did we get there? My mom did such a good job establishing bookstores throughout Poland that the Polish communist government decided to send her to France to establish Polish bookstores for the Polish immigrant community in France to try to entice them to come back. My mom did set up a number of bookstores. My wife and I saw one of them in Paris, I don't know, about a dozen years ago. But my mom defected. That summer, my mom defected, went to the American embassy, applied for a visa for herself and for me. Her visa came through relatively quickly. And in September of 1949, my mom came to America. My visa didn't. So once again, she had to find some strangers with whom to keep me. And she found this Polish-French couple in Paris. I lived with them for several months. During the days, I would wander all around Paris, ride the metro, picked up enough French just by listening, so that whenever I got lost, I could ask somebody in French, how do I get home? And they'll answer me in French, and I got home every time. Not too quickly, maybe, but I got home. And eventually my visa came through, and on the 1st of December, 1949, this Polish-French couple put me on an airplane in Paris. My mom met me in New York. We spent a couple of weeks in New York. And then my visa finally came through, and then this Polish-French couple put me on an airplane in Paris. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit behind or ahead of myself. After a couple of weeks in New York, we took a train to North Carolina, to a little town called Cove City, 1,000 population, tiny place. So this was like maybe late December 1949. In January 1950, when school opened, my mom right away put me into school. She put me into sixth grade because I had been in fifth grade in Poland, in Warsaw. Um, the only problem was I didn't speak a word of English and no one there spoke Polish. But my mom thought that'd be the best way for me to learn quickly how to speak English because I had to, and she was right. By the time we left was a year and a half later. So uh, half of the sixth grade and the seventh grade, yeah, a year and a half later, I was already relatively fluent in English. Um, However, the problems were the first few weeks in North Carolina when I didn't speak any English, and the kids were very friendly. They tried to teach me, for example, they tried to teach me baseball because there was no baseball at that time in Poland. And I kept making, because I didn't know what they were talking about. I kept making social mistakes. And the best, let's say the most serious, most embarrassing mistake was when they tried to teach me how to play baseball. That was also then was the most embarrassing. Now is the funniest. So if we have time, ask me to tell you about it, but it was very embarrassing. And I kept making a lot of social mistakes because I didn't feel the culture. I didn't speak very well at first. Uh, the After the year and a half, oh, and by the way, during the summers, the kids worked on the farms for pocket money. I did that too, picking strawberries, picking beans, working on the sawmills. I never made much money picking strawberries because I was eating too many of them. I made better money after my senior year working on sawmills because I wanted to have enough cash. I love cars. So I wanted to have enough cash to buy an old used car when I got to college. One thing happened to me in my junior year that I want to share with you because I say this on purpose to the school kids when I speak. And probably 90% of my talks are to high school or middle schools. And what happened was that a vocational counselor came to our high school to help guide us what courses or what elective courses we're going to take or should take, depending to the last term of junior year and through the senior year, depending on what our plans were. Were we going to work with our parents on their farms? Were we going to work on sawmills or work as a logger in the field, in the forests? When it was my turn, he asked me, what are my plans? And ever since then, I wanted to do something with airplanes. So I said, well, I want to go to college and become an aeronautical engineer. And he said, well, you're probably not smart enough to be an aeronautical engineer, but you'd be a really good car mechanic. Well, as I told you, I love cars. And when I bought my used car and I couldn't afford to pay anybody to fix it, I learned how to fix it myself. But I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. And I thought, why is he discouraging me? He should be encouraging me. He should be helping me. And it kind of came to my mind that maybe he got discouraged himself and he's just passing it on. And I decided right there and then, I'm not going to let him discourage me. And I'm telling this to the school kids when I speak to them, because I tell them, if somebody discourages you from something that you really want to do in your life and you are willing to work hard for it, don't let them. Just work hard and you get there. And in my case, until then, I was getting A's mostly, but also B's and C's. After that event, I get nothing but A's. And in my senior year, I went to the math teacher because I liked him, and I asked him if it was a good college for aeronautical engineering. And he said, well, the best one is MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Never heard of it. I had no idea that it was very hard to get into. And I was very naive. That's a nice way of saying stupid. And that was the only college I applied to. But I was also lucky and I got in. And altogether, I spent 8.5 years studying at MIT in 3 different sequences. I got 4 degrees, 2 in aeronautical engineering, 2 in nuclear engineering, including a Ph.D. And I worked in the aerospace industry, both in between my stints at MIT and then afterwards. I became a rocket engine designer, and my best job was with a team that designed the variable thrust rocket engine, which lowered our Apollo astronauts controllably to the surface of the moon. It was a great job, a great team, great satisfaction. After the aerospace industry, I worked after the aerospace industry, I started working in foreign trade, representing American companies in Russia. I did that for about 25 years, and probably during that, just 25 years, I probably made maybe 200 trips to Moscow, back and forth, back and forth. And all through that time, through those 25 years plus the previous 40 or whatever, I kept the Holocaust at an emotional distance. I never talked about it. None of my classmates knew about it. In college, only my best friend knew about it. I never wanted to see any Holocaust movies, read any Holocaust books. And the reason is that I saw what it did to my mom. She was a very, very successful businesswoman in America, but she was haunted by the Holocaust till her dying day. She died 17 years ago at the age of 91, and the Holocaust never left her. And I didn't want that to happen to me. So I kept it all at an emotional distance until November 2009. My wife asked if it's okay to rent a movie called Paper Clips, which she told me it was a documentary that takes place in a small town in Tennessee. It doesn't show any Holocaust scenes. It takes place in the year 2000 in Tennessee. So don't worry about seeing the Holocaust. So I said, sure. Well, there was one scene in the movie that made me realize that my story has value. And when my wife asked me when the movie ended whether I would change my mind about refusing to write my book, I surprised her. I surprised myself. I told her I would do it. Started the next day, finished it 3 months later. So that was now about March of 2010. Next slide, please. I right away, this is my Forest Grove High School picture. As I say, I was embarrassed through most of the high school. Next slide, please. I wrote my book, Neither Yesterday's Nor Tomorrow's, and I didn't want to sell it. I wanted people to read it. So I put it instantly, that was in March of 2010. I put it instantly on for free access website on scribe.com, where people can read it for free on their computer. They can print it on the computer printer. I was also asked by friends to have the book available. So I did put it on Amazon. I think it costs something under $10 on Amazon. It's a small book. And then I was also asked by a newspaper reporter in San Francisco, where I live, to whether I had a website. And I said, no, why? I said, well, if you're going to be speaking to schools, students may ask interesting questions about what they do or don't understand about the Holocaust. So their questions and your answers would be of interest for other people. So I did start a website called neitheryesterdays.com. Every one of my talks, and there's been more than 300 by now, is on there. This one will be also with whatever photograph that I can get. Certainly pre-COVID days, we took a lot of photographs of the students. Not so when things went online, but there's still some photographs. But I thought with this, having written the book and having put it on the free access website and printed, I thought I was finished. Well, that's not what happened, because my best friend in college still lives in, my best friend from MIT. He knew I just wrote a book. He knew I published it. He told somebody at MIT, the head of MIT Hillel, Rabbi Michelle Fisher, that I had just written this book. She was organizing, this was like late March, she was organizing an event at the downtown Holocaust Memorial on Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was April 10th. And she contacted me, asked me would I come to speak. My first reaction was hell no, because I was afraid. This was too sensitive for me to get in front of a crowd, even if it was an MIT crowd. But it was too sensitive for me. But I realized I was being a coward. And I already had tickets to fly to Boston because I was and am on a number of MIT committees. So I changed my mind. I told her I'll do it. And I practiced, and I got up there. I was the last speaker. And when she said, okay, George, it's your turn, I learned something from the previous speaker about the Warsaw Ghetto that I didn't know. And that made me choke. And I tried to speak and I choked and I continued trying. And eventually I made my speech with a lot of choking. But the audience was probably about 60, 70 MIT people, grad students, professors that I knew, etc. And enough of them walk up to me immediately and said, George, you got to keep doing this. You got to keep telling your story so it's not forgotten. So I immediately contacted Facing History and Ourselves. They are based in Boston, in Brookline. And I've been speaking ever since. So far, as I say, it's 310 or 311 talks. Every time I post a new post on my website, it tells me how many I've done. So this is probably my talk number 311. And the reason I talk only in high schools or middle schools is because they're already old enough to understand what I lived through and what I survived, but yet they're still young enough to have an open mind, to decide for themselves whether they want to live their life on the side of fairness and truth and tolerance, on the side of anger and hate and prejudice and anti-Semitism. And I tell them that they maybe had the choice already. They ever saw somebody being bullied. What do? Just keep walking and let the bullying continue? Or did you stop and face the bully and say, stop it? So that's a choice that they already made. Said later on in your life, you will see tougher choices because I'm addressing students. So you might see mob actions, beatings, even killings. I tell them it's happening in parts of the world right now. It's happened in the United States. A couple of years ago in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, gunman went in and killed 11 people. Before that or after that, very nearby, there was Charlottesville, Virginia, an anti-Semitic march. And one person was killed. The shame of that was that when our then president, Donald Trump, was asked about it, he said, well, there's some very fine people on both sides. No, there are no fine people on the side of anti-Semitism, hatred, and anger, and racism. All the fine people are on the side of truth and fairness and tolerance. That's where all the fine people are. So after my talk, after the massacre at in Pittsburgh, the synagogue, I was asked by the Haas Graduate School for Business at Berkeley. They have a leadership course, and the leadership course asked for a survivor to come and talk to them. And I did. I gave them pretty much the same as I've told you. But right afterwards, enough of them asked me essentially the same question. And that is, what can we as individuals do to fight anti-Semitism and racism and intolerance? And the answer I learned was, first, stand up, speak up and stand up. Whoever is saying things like that, even by in a sense of humor, it is very funny. Just say, I want to hear that again. I want my friends to hear it too. I don't think it's very funny. And apparently prejudice and racism, they rise in the shadows, but they slowly filter away in the light of day. So make those people face their own words. That takes courage on your part and on my part. But it works sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't, but it works. So I hope that when faced, or on the other thing is that, I tell this to the students that after you graduate and you're old enough to vote, volunteer to work for leaders, whether they are political leaders or social leaders, who also seriously resist and talk against prejudice and racism and anti-Semitism. Some leaders do, some leaders don't, but support those that do. That's it. Thank you very much. Any questions are valid. Any questions? So thank you.
Thank you so much, George. That was great. We do have a couple questions. The first being, have you returned to Poland? And if so, what was that like?
It's a short question. The short question is yes, but I'll give you the long answer because I think there's a lot to this. I absolutely had no intention of going back to Poland. And that's a part of the title of my book. It's the reason it's called Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows, is that because many of the people that kept me during the war, they saved me. I know that, but some of them weren't very nice to me. Or perhaps maybe one person, the leader of the family, said, yes, I want to do the right thing. But maybe some of the other parts of the family, or people in the family, thought that they were being endangered and they took it out on me. So I wasn't always treated very well. I wasn't fed very well. So and I've learned instinctively to forget bad things from the past. And not just from childhood, but even now. I mean, I've had some hang gliding accidents. I've had motorcycle accidents. When I walk away from it, I don't remember anything. I mean, I'm sorry. When I walk away from it, I even remember hitting the ground. But the one time when I was hurt, surely there was 5-10 seconds between the time I knew I was going to hit the hill till the time I hit the hill. Blank out completely. So I forget the past. That's painful automatically. That's why neither yesterdays nor tomorrows, because I never knew when I would see my mother or whether I'd ever see her again. That is why nor tomorrows. I've learned to focus on today, focus solving my problems of today. I know that in business, it's better to plan. I don't plan, but I've done well enough. But I do not look to the future, and I tackle and I solve every problem that comes up. So I've been lucky. And that is why when I've been asked, in one of the schools where I speak, they have an international event where they have students from Poland, from United Arab Emirates, from Germany, from China, from England come in for a week, and they have people speaking. And I'm usually either the first or the last speaker of that event. And it's been going on since my first talk there was 2010, and I've spoken there every year. And the Polish group always asks me whether I've been back to Poland, and I say no. And they ask me why, and I tell them neither yesterday nor tomorrow's, and they always accept that. But I've also sent my books to them, to the school, so they're distributed to the students and the teachers that come in with the students. And after 3-4 years, one of the teachers came up to me after my talk and they said, look, I understand why you don't want to come back to Poland, but we have the same event as Charles Wright Academy in Seattle is staging, which is where I was speaking. Would you come and speak at that event? And everybody there speaks English. All my students speak English. I said, no, I don't want to come back to Poland, and neither yesterday nor tomorrow is my answer. She was a very smart teacher. She said, okay, can we maintain a dialogue by email? I said, sure. About a month or two later, she writes me an email saying, in your book, there's a photograph of your father. Now, I know you don't remember him because you were only 1 year old, but I looked through the archives that are on the web in Warsaw, and I found the Polish or the Warsaw 1939 Warsaw phone book. And I looked under ease and I found your father's name, Elbaum. And I'm enclosing that page. And I think in my next slide might be it. No, I don't know. It might be. Well, if it is or it isn't, it would be the page from the Warsaw. Yeah, there it is. That's the 1939 Warsaw phone book. I looked at that and it was like a blow to my chest, because my mother would tell me that, even the photo of my father, when he was younger in the book, she said, it doesn't look like him. So my father was never a real person to me. And when I saw that phone book and I saw his name in there, and I realized people were calling him at that phone number, at that address for his professional services as a lawyer, I thought he was a real person. And I really felt like I had a blow to my chest. And I got back on the computer and I wrote to her. Her name was Anna. I said, Anya, you got me. I'll come to your event. And I came to their event, and they asked me to come back to the next year's event. And I said, I will, but only if you have arranged for me to have two more I think two talks in two more cities. One, Warsaw, and I went 4 talks in Warsaw, and I went 4 talks in Lublin, because both of them had large Jewish populations and therefore a lot of anti-Semitism. And they arranged that. And ever since then, I've been going back there, and I've had some very satisfying feedback from Polish students, very satisfying. Some of them essentially feeling that, well, I'll give you one very short example. One school, it was a German student actually. One of the schools I spoke in, one of the smaller towns, the administration came to me and said, we know you'll be speaking about your Holocaust childhood, but we have some German students, high school students here with us in the audience. And the audience was about 100 Polish students and a dozen of the German students. She said, do you mind if they come listen to you? I said, no, not at all. And I noticed when I was speaking, a girl in like second or third row from the front, the blonde girl, was staring intently at me, more so than some of the others. And when I finished speaking, finished the Q&A, she came to me very quick. She jumped up and she wanted to be the first one, to ask me a question. But she didn't. She said, look, she says, what you've told me about your life, it's totally different from what I heard at my grandparents' dining room table. And I am ashamed of my parents and my grandparents. And she broke out crying, just out and out. 100 Polish students and her dozen German classmates, and she just broke out in a loud cry. And all I could do is put my arms around her and say, it's not your fault what your parents or grandparents thought or did. But I hope that you will convey my message forward. So again, situations like that, or with Polish kids, I realize I'm having an effect. I've probably gotten thousands of letters or emails from Polish students. And each one of them, their questions, I've answered them. Long answer to a short question.
That's a great answer, though. One of the questions we just got in was, have you ever encountered in your adult life radical groups, and how do you handle that?
I've never, well, yes and no. One of the guys with whom I used to hang glide, he is a very good pilot, and he would hang glide together. But this was still, before I wrote my book. I never talked about my background. I didn't know anything about his. He married a French woman, moved to France, and from France he started to. He and I would fly together. He was a very good pilot, and I mean together, we would each one in a separate glider. But when he moved to France, he started flying powered gliders, and he would start sending me videos of himself flying, and I would respond, good flying, good maneuver, this and that. Then he started sending me information of different kinds of subversive moves, ultra right wing, and I ignored them. Conspiracy theories, right wing, and I ignored them because I knew there's no point. And then he started sending me things denying the Holocaust. Obviously, he knew nothing about me, about my background, and I didn't know about his feeling about the Holocaust, because when we were together, we just talked hang gliding or drinking. I wasn't a big drinker, but after hang gliding for an hour, 2 hours, one gets thirsty. Anyway, so he sent me an email denying the Holocaust. And I would send him some information, like, for example, he would say, well, 6 million Jews could not have moved to Israel because okay, that's what he said, that they all moved to Israel. I said, no. When Israel was founded, there was 600,000 Jews living there. And here's a Wikipedia reference for that. So he sent me something else, and I gave him a Wikipedia response on that. Finally, I had enough. And after 3 or 4 times, I said to him, look, I knew a family in Warsaw that had a dozen people. Only 2 people survived, my mom and I. Don't tell me it didn't happen. I thought that'd be it. I would never hear from him again. Nope. A week goes by in email silence, and he said, well, it could not have been the Nazis because the Nazis and Hitler abhorred violence. He called it National Socialists. They abhorred violence. If anything, first of all, he said, I'm sorry your family suffered. Not that they were killed. I'm sorry they suffered. But it could not have been the Nazis that did it. It was the Poles. And to that, I wrote him back. I said, I never want to hear from you again. So once an adult has made up their mind like he did, there's no changing their mind, no changing their mind. I also used to fly together with a guy that I knew he was a designer of rockets at Peenemünde, which was the Nazi base where they built V1s and V2s. And we never talked about the war, but once he started talking about the war, I said to him, hey, he said the worst crime in the world, atrocity, was the firebombing raids against Dresden and Hamburg, when hundreds of thousands of people were killed by Allied firebombing raids. And I said, that was horrible, but what about the millions that the Nazis killed? He said, well, no, that's a different story. With that, I went to my management of the company. I said, get me out of his office or get him out of my office, but I don't ever want to face him again. So yeah, there's no changing of their mind if they are radical about anything. And that's why I don't want to talk to adults.
Kind of off of that, what do you think people can do to stand against anti-Semitism, other forms of hatred?
Well, one thing is what I tell my students or their listeners is stand up and speak up. But that takes courage. That takes courage. And, whether it's bullying or whether it's anti-Semitism, it takes courage to do that. But as I say, also for adults, supporting those voters that have a say, and whether it's local politicians or local civic leaders or whatever, some may be anti-Semitic and some may not be. Choose your support carefully. I do. I do.
Bit of a lighter question now. How did you and your wife meet?
Oh, well, I've been riding motorcycles since I graduated college. So that was 1959. And both she and I worked for the same aerospace company. And one time, and I was the manager of the systems engineering department, and she was working as a technical editor in the publications department. And one time I had a very important contract conclusion, a report to submit to my military customer, and but it was late. There wasn't much time for it, so I took it up to the publications department where she worked, and I said, "This is very important. Please, please, please get it out on time." And they did. So afterwards, after this had to be sometimes in early spring or mid-spring in LA. This was in Los Angeles. That's where this company was. It was called Planning Research Corporation. It was a for-profit think tank, and I said I wanted to, and I thought they got the very good report for me, and they did it in plenty of time, and not in very small time. I said I want to thank them, because I didn't distinguish who was what, or who. And this was LA. Strawberries just appeared on the market. So I said, I'll buy a big basket of strawberries, like many, like a half a dozen or a dozen baskets within a big basket. And I'll take it up to them and thank them. And I did that. And I passed it around. I said, I really want to thank you guys. You did a great job in a short time. I thank you very much. And the basket went all the way around and came back to me. And there were a few strawberries left. And I said, oh, who else wants another strawberry? One person answered. That was my wife. So we started talking. And I was riding my motorcycle to work that day, or most days then. That was in Westwood, where UCLA is. And and just out of friendliness, I said, you want to go riding with me sometimes for lunch? Maybe stop somewhere for lunch. She said, sure. So we went riding. On the way back, within a block or two of the office, we got hit by a car. The joke was that which stuck out the furthest got hurt. For me, it was my shoulder. For her, it was her hip. But that started with a friendship. And then it's what wound up to be much more than a friendship. We've been married now for 40, it'd be 49 years in March. And each year gets better and better. So all I can do is wish everyone the same amount of luck, whether it's survival or whether it's marriage, the same amount of luck.
Lovely. Right now, that is all the questions I'm seeing. Thank you
Okay.
so much for doing this today.
Well, I thank you for the questions, and I apologize if my answers were a lot longer than your questions, but I guess I feel I have a story to tell, which is why I keep doing it. And I'll tell you this: for the first several years, there wasn't a single chat where I didn't choke up. And even here, at one point, I choked up. I don't know whether you noticed, but I choked up because it still hurts a little bit. But I realized, particularly with our young people, with students, it's worth that I put every effort and all the energy that I have. As long as I can still speak, I will still be speaking to students. Thank you very much.